Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. Greetings, gamer, and welcome to Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. I'm your host, like Starwalker. DeFoggi and Nick Johnson join me on the show today to discuss the 13th Age role-playing game. This is the first of a two-part interview. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener and fellow GM and or player. Welcome to episode 13 of Game Master's Journey. I'm Lex Starwalker, and I am transmitting this message from the Obsidian Monolith somewhere outside time and space. Just as an aside, I have to say that after 13 times, or 13 episodes, where I have to say the little "together we can become game masters truly worthy of the title," I'm actually starting to be able to get that out. That's actually something of a tongue twister. A tongue twister? Is that the right term? For me, that doesn't sound right. Tongue twister. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. I especially the first few episodes, I had so much trouble getting that out. I had to do it over and over and over. But practice makes perfect, and I've said it enough times now that it's almost starting to come easy. Hopefully by the end of season 1, I'll be able to get it out every time without having to redo it. So, as you know, I've talked quite a bit about Dungeons & Dragons in the past couple episodes, and so today I am going to change gears and I'm going to start to talk about 13th Age, which is another fantasy role-playing game. It's similar to D&D in some ways and very different in other ways, and I am assuming that most, if not everyone listening to this show is familiar with either D&D 3rd edition or D&D 5th edition or Pathfinder. So we kind of take that tack with the interview, kind of comparing and contrasting 13th Age to these other games. So I have a great interview for you today with DeFoggi and Nick Johnson. They are both hosts of the Iconic podcast, which is a 13th Age podcast that I highly recommend you check out, especially if you're interested in 13th Age. However, even if you're not particularly interested in 13th Age, it's still a great podcast to listen to because, like this podcast, they will often have discussions that are relevant to pretty much any game that you're playing. And they have a lot of interviews with people in the industry, which are really interesting to listen to, even if you're not playing whatever particular game that person worked on, just to hear from writers and designers about their experiences and their thoughts about role-playing games. It's really interesting stuff. So definitely check out the Iconic podcast. I will have all kinds of links in the show notes for this episode. So definitely head on over to starwalkerstudios.com and check out the show notes for episode 13 of Game Master's Journey, because there are a ton of links there. So I really wanted to give you a good introduction to 13th Age, so I didn't try to limit the time of the interview at all, and it ended up being way too much to fit into 1.5 hour episode of Game Master's Journey. So what I've done is I've split it into 2 parts, so you will be able to hear the second part of the interview next week on episode 15. Now, not only is this a great introduction to 13th Age, but this interview also contains some great advice for coming up with a campaign that fits the characters that the players make. And there are different philosophies and different methods that different GMs use. Some GMs come up with a very involved campaign and then give the players lots of guidelines for making their characters so they can make a character to fit into that campaign. 13th Age tends to favor more a method where you very much build a campaign around the characters that the players make. So maybe you give them some guidelines, but you let them make their characters, and then you build a campaign that really fits the characters that they made. And that's a really cool way to do it. And so we have some discussion about that. And if that's kind of your style, or that's a style that you want to explore more, 13th Age is definitely a great game to do it with. Now, before we get to the interview, I do have a couple other things I want to talk about real quick. First of all, I want to take a minute to thank the patrons of the show. I have a few patrons now who've come over to the Game Master's Journey Patreon from the GM Intrusions Patreon. So they're listeners that have been with me for a long time, and they've moved over, and that's awesome. And I also have some new patrons on both shows, which is super cool. And I just want to say that I really appreciate the support of the patrons, and I really appreciate, anything that listeners do to support the show and support Star Walker Studios. And not only do I appreciate it, but I actually rely on the support of the patrons to keep the show going, this show and the other shows that we do. I am a full-time podcaster now, so your support not only keeps the lights on here at Star Walker Studios and keeps Game Master's Journey in your ear holes, but it also actually helps put food on our table, which is a good thing to have. So you can learn more about our Patreon at patreon.com/Game Master's Journey, and that's Patreon. If you're not familiar with Patreon, the Game Master's Journey podcast and all of the Star Walker Studios podcasts are going to start to be available live. And for those of you that like listening to, a well-polished and produced and edited podcast, you can still enjoy the same content that you've always enjoyed from Star Walker Studios. I'm still going to have, very high production value podcasts for you. But for those of you that want to see the show live, I will start streaming when I record. I've already done this with the last episode of Star Citizens United that I did, and currently I stream D&D and Numenera games on Twitch. So you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Star Walker Studios, and I am running a D&D campaign every Thursday from 6:30 Eastern Time till 10 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday. I'm running my Obsidian Monolith game every other Friday, and that one is from 6 to 9 Eastern Time. And then very soon I'm going to be running another Numenera campaign called Ninth World Explorers, where we will be exploring some of the new areas revealed in the Ninth World Guidebook for Numenera, and that will be every other Tuesday. And I don't remember off the top of my head what time that is. It's around 6 or 7. I think it's 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And I believe our next session is the 24th. But you can always find my schedule on twitch.tv/Star Walker Studios. And also, once the games are done streaming, so I stream them live while we're actually playing. And then once the game is finished, I put the recording on YouTube. So you can find my YouTube channel at youtube.com/C/Star Walker Studios. And then also I am, as I said, going to be streaming all of my podcasts from now on. So the way that works is you just go to starwalkerstudios.com/live. And if I am streaming a podcast, you will find it there. Also, if I am streaming on Twitch, you will also find that there. So Game Master's Journey, I usually record those on Mondays, usually Monday morning, late morning to early afternoon, Eastern Time on Mondays. And then Age of Gaming, I record on Tuesdays. Star Citizens United, I record on Wednesdays. And then Beer Tasters are all over the map when I record those, because I have to find a time that Nikki and I both can do it. I will let people know on Google Plus and on Twitter when I'm going to start streaming. So if you want to catch one of those, definitely follow me on Google Plus. Just search for Lex Starwalker. You can also find a link to that on the website at starwalkerstudios.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker, and I will try very hard to announce on both when I am going to stream. But if you want to pick one, Google Plus is definitely the place to be. That's where I really focus my efforts. Twitter's kind of an afterthought for me just because it's so limited, but I will try to post on Twitter, but I will definitely always post on Google Plus when I'm going to be streaming. Another great way to kind of keep up on things, at least for this show, is to join the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community, and I will always post on there when I'm going to be recording the show. So yeah, you can come check me out. Also with the podcast, all of those will also be on YouTube after the fact as unedited video recordings, so you can go check those out later if you want. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, there's also a chat room. So whether you're watching me streaming on Twitch or you're watching one of the podcasts on the Star Walker Studios site, there will be a chat room where you can talk to me and you can talk to other people who are watching. So that'll be really cool. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing some of you in the chat room during the live shows. That'll be awesome. So that's it. As to my announcements, we'll get on to the interview. I just want to once again mention that there will be lots of links in the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com. So if you want to find more information about 13th Age or about JM or Nick, go check out the show notes, and I've got tons of links there of all kinds of resources to help you out. So without further ado, on to the interview. JM, DeFoggi, and Nick Johnson are joining me on the podcast today, and they do another podcast called Iconic Podcast. It is a 13th Age podcast. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hello.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah.
So maybe you can start out and you can just tell us a little bit about yourselves.
My name is Nick Johnson. I live in Colorado Springs and have a wonderful wife and 2 kids. I've been playing role-playing games for about a year and a half now. JM introduced me by corralling me into doing a play-by-post, because I like writing and I like telling stories, and so I kind of got introduced to that, and then he pulled me into his Tuesday night game and got introduced a little bit to D&D 4th edition, and played a little bit of Pathfinder, and I've just been dabbling bits and pieces here and there in all sorts of different systems. And then we found Numenera, and I fell in love with that, largely due to the weirdness of it and telling great stories. Really captured my attention. And launching from there, 13th Age also, there was a lot of similarities I saw between Numenera and 13th Age, but 13th Age was a lot more invested in fantasy as opposed to the weird sci-fi fantasy of Numenera. So we've been playing quite a bit of that, and then JM and I started talking, or we've been big fans of GM Intrusions, and started talking about, well, maybe we should do a podcast about 13th Age.
Nice.
And next thing we know, we're on air, so thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of where Iconic came from. We both got into Numenera, and I was sharing that I'd started listening to GM Intrusions while I was running, and about halfway through, you made some sort of comment about how you got started in podcasting, and I was like, we could do this. And
anybody could do it.
That's kind of where it spun out, yeah. Well, I'm John Matthew DeFoggi. I go by JM. I've been gaming since like 1991. I started with Heroes Unlimited and GURPS, so lots of different iterations of D&D, and if it's out there, I've probably at least read it at this point.
Awesome.
And I'm actually branching out now into writing some settings for a Kickstarter for Fate.
Awesome. Yeah, I saw that on Google+.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited. Kickstarter's about 40 to 45% funded right now. Go check out Shadowcraft: The Glamour War. I'm pretty excited about it. It's kind of like Changeling meets D&D meets Mission Impossible.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. I was looking at that the other day. If I have this right, your characters are basically humans that were abducted by the fairies and have since taken over Arcadia.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So Reroll Productions approached me about writing it, and as soon as they kind of started talking about it, I was like, yes, this is just the kind of crazy genre mashup that I enjoy.
Yeah, that looks really cool, and I'll definitely put a link to that Kickstarter in the show notes so people can check it out.
Thanks.
And that has not been going very long, right? And you guys are already, what'd you say, 45% funded?
Yeah, it launched Monday morning, I think.
Yeah, nice. Very good.
I might be obsessively refreshing that page.
I think that's common. So I specifically had you guys on because, as we mentioned, you guys do a 13th Age podcast, and I've been listening to it and really enjoying it. And I have not actually played 13th Age. We're going to remedy that really soon.
That's right.
But I don't really know much about it except that it's similar to D&D in some ways. But I hear so many people just rave about 13th Age, and I've heard a lot of people say, oh, now that I played 13th Age, I won't ever go back to D&D, and people just love it. So I thought it'd be great to have you guys on, and you can tell us all about it.
Oh, awesome. I can start. I had heard a lot about 13th Age in Google Plus communities and on online forums, but I was like, I really don't need another D20 fantasy game.
Right.
But I read someone's review, and his review is what got me to pick up the book. I looked over at my blog because I wanted to get the quote right. He said it's like if D&D went to a frat party and knocked up a hot indie game, 13th Age would be their child.
Nice.
And I was like, well, okay, now I have to look it up. And so 13th Age is the brainchild of Jonathan Tweet, who is one of the designers of 3rd edition D&D.
Okay.
And Rob Heinzu, who was the designer of 4th edition D&D. And from what I understand, the two of them played in each other's games and kind of came to the conclusion that neither of them ran their own games the way they were written.
Okay.
And they should write a game the way they play games at their table. So it's got elements of 3.5, it's got elements of 4, but is its own unique beast.
Awesome. Now, obviously, if people really want to know a lot about 13th Age, they can go check out Iconic Podcast.
That's right.
But I thought maybe you guys could just kind of nutshell it for us today, and maybe we could start out by talking about kind of like how does the basic mechanic of the game work?
If you've played D&D,
yeah,
you know how the basic mechanic of 13th Age works. It's D20 plus modifier versus a target number for skills and combat.
Okay.
And then a variety of other dice for damage and hit points and icon relationships.
Yeah, and actually I was looking at a character sheet you sent me last night, and it looks very familiar. Your strength, dexterity, constitution, all that looks the same. The bonuses even look the same as 3rd or 5th edition.
Yeah, they scale the same way. You get a +1 every 2 points above 10, I think is the way it works.
Yeah.
So an 18 is a +4 modifier.
Yeah, that's exactly the same. So I guess maybe what we should talk about is how is it different?
Well, one of the things that sets it apart is your characters only go up to level 10 instead of level 20.
Oh, really?
So you've got a much narrower gap as far as progression goes. But the thought behind that is you're already starting out as a hero character. You aren't starting out as a farmer who just happened to pick up his father's sword or anything like that. You're already starting out well into the game, well experienced in what you're doing. So there isn't as much of a progression, but at the same time, you start out jumping right into the story and being able to be a pretty strong character. And I think story is a good way of summarizing what I saw as one of the key differences between 13th Age and D&D is that the mechanics of 13th Age I felt really boosted the narrative and boosted the story of what you're doing as your character and at your table. D&D, especially 5th edition, I think is moving that direction, but I don't know. I felt like it was still the story was kind of supplementing the mechanics, and 13th Age is kind of the other way around, that the mechanics are really supplementing the story. For instance, instead of getting specific skills that you're trained in and things like that, you have a background. For instance, you may choose a background of, I won 2nd place in the National Gladiator competition. And what you do with that background is you're able to take the points assigned to that and use it for any number of checks. It might be a social check, it might be an acrobatics check, it might be an intimidation check or something like that. And as long as you can convince the GM that background is an asset, or if you can convince the GM that background leads you to getting that bonus in that situation, then you're able to use it.
We had one guy in our 13th Age game who had, he was a battlefield medic, was one of his backgrounds.
Okay.
And he was fantastic at justifying, having to leap over corpses to get to people who needed aid, or using it as a perception skill because, over at the din of battle, you have to be able to hear people calling out for the medic. In addition to kind of what you would assume, like brewing potions or applying first aid or things like that.
Okay, cool.
So as long as you can be really creative with how you're going to use those backgrounds and be a little bit generic in setting them initially, you can, the sky's the limit on what you could use your backgrounds to do a check for. You just got to get really creative and be good at convincing the GM.
Okay. This is reminding me of, sounds a lot like aspects in Fate.
Yes.
And I'm curious if you run into the same problem that I've heard with Fate, is where people try to pick like really broad aspects that they can apply to anything, and then the game becomes all about, how well can you BS the GM into letting you use this aspect for everything under the sun. Are there like guidelines? Are there specific backgrounds that you choose from, or can you make your own backgrounds, or how does that work?
You can make anything you can make up anything you want.
Okay.
They try to encourage the idea that it is a snapshot of who your character was before the game started.
Okay.
So like the second, somebody who was took second place in a gladiator tournament, or trained by the Highlands Orc assassin clan. But the advantage is they cap them at 5 points to start. So
Okay.
even if you have one that applies in a variety of situations, it's still not going to be game breaking.
Gotcha.
That, and the fact that there are other things that tie into backgrounds, like knowing people, using them to establish conflict. So if Nick had a background that said, oh, he was the second best, took second place in this gladiator tournament, well, somebody had to take third, and that guy's probably not real happy with Nick's character.
And somebody took first, and he can kick Nick's character's ass.
That's right.
So the backgrounds aren't just a mechanical benefit; they also tie in the story that the players and the GM are telling.
Okay.
It gives fodder to the GMs to introduce conflict or story elements. If he's not sure where to go next, then maybe the case of the gladiator, you find the party finds themselves back at the place that the tournament took place, and run into the third place winner or something like that.
Mm-hmm. The other thing mechanically that's probably one of the biggest differences from previous versions of D&D is, although you have like what they call simple classes, so like the barbarian and the ranger, which play a lot like your 3rd edition character, where it's just basically skills and rolling to hit with some feats that augment that.
Okay.
All the way to the fighter and the wizard, which play a little bit more like your 4th edition character, where you have powers that are based off encounters. Damage scales like wizard spells do. So if you're a fighter and you're swinging a sword that does a d8 at level 5, you're rolling 5d8 for damage. There's no more of this, melee classes progress linearly and spellcasting classes progress, exponentially.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds pretty cool.
It is. There's nothing quite like being a fighter with a great sword and, rolling 90-10 for damage against a dragon. You definitely feel like a badass.
Yeah, because that's always been kind of a thing with D&D is, at the beginning of the game, the fighters are awesome and the wizards suck. And at the end of the game, the wizards are awesome and the fighters suck.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that sounds really cool. You mentioned how the backgrounds are more than just mechanics, and they actually affect kind of the direction that the story takes. And I know from talking with you guys before that it sounds like there's a lot of, I guess, world building that actually happens like at the table.
Yes.
And the players have a lot of say in that. Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, for me as a GM, the two biggest things that kind of do the world building at the table, you have the icons, which they're not quite gods. The best example I have that relates to D&D would be like Drizzt would be an icon.
Okay.
Or Elminster in Forgotten Realms would be an icon. Or even the Masked Lords of Waterdeep. So kind of the movers and shakers of the world.
Okay.
And players establish relationships with these people. And, if you have Elminster as a major mover and shaker in the Forgotten Realms, but none of your players take any relationship dice with them, forget about him. Just maybe mention him in passing, but move on and focus on the aspects that your players are interested in.
Okay.
And these relationship rolls, at the start of every session, you're going to roll your relationship dice with your icons. And on 6s, that icon will show up somehow in the game. Whether it's you have a piece of information that he's given you, or one of his aides or agents shows up and gives you a magic item or helps you out. On a 5, he shows up, but you owe him something. So it could be even the tie of the adventure. You start off, and Lex, you have you roll a 5 with the Archmage. Well, the Archmage shows up and says, hey, I've got this awesome boon for you, but that's because I'm sending you out on this mission, and bring your friends along, but you're the reason that this adventure is starting. So
any given game session, you just have one of these icons that are in play for one character, not everybody's all at once?
Oh no, everybody's all at once. So it can either go really light or really heavy on the icons.
Okay.
You either have everybody's rolling 5s and 6s and you're overwhelmed as the GM, but you don't really need to worry about anything because you can always tie it back to one of their rolls. Or nobody rolls it, and that usually happens on nights where I've prepared very little, expecting the relationship rolls to drive the story. I've never had a perfect balance yet.
Well, a lot of times, too, the GM can assign the responsibility of explaining the icon relationships to the players themselves. So, if in the case of a night where everyone's rolling 5s and 6s, instead of the GM trying to balance, how are we going to make all this work, when it comes time to cash in one of those 5s or 6s, you can ask the player, well, tell me how this happens. Why do you benefit from this relationship? And kind of put it back on the player to elaborate and explain that way.
And is that a D6 that you're rolling for this?
Yes.
So 2 out of 6 times there's going to be something going on with someone's icon, basically.
Unless you have one of our buddies in the party who, every game, all 3 are coming up. It doesn't matter whose dice he's rolling with, the icons love him. The other bit of world building that goes on at the start of the game is your one unique thing.
Okay.
It's a non-mechanical statement about your character, what makes him unique. And it can be just about anything, but it cannot have a direct combat benefit. So you can't say, I breathe fire, or I shoot lightning out of my eyes. I mean, you could say that, but you're going to have to realize that it's not necessarily going to default as a mechanical benefit. Okay. Maybe something that you'll have to, as you level up, develop. But when you say something unique about yourself, you're either saying, I'm the only one in the world who is like this, or I'm the only one in the world who has kind of had this happen to them. So if you say, I'm the only dark elf left at court, well, suddenly the entire race of dark elves has disappeared. And the GM has to work that into the story.
Interesting.
Or should work that into the story, I should say.
And sometimes it's not I am the only, or I'm the last dark elf. It may be, I believe I'm the last dark elf.
Mm-hmm.
So you could have the, most of the campaign where there are no other dark elves present, and then at one session, all of a sudden you introduce another one and totally floor the player.
Yeah. One of the writers for 13th Age at Gen Con had a scenario where somebody said something along the lines of, he said he had a horrible memory.
Okay.
This character's one unique thing was a horrible memory. So by making himself the only person in the world with a horrible memory, Gareth was initially going to say there was no written word in the world because everyone had a perfect memory.
Oh.
Why would there be any need for written word?
Right.
But as the game developed, they ended up saying that it's because every time this person went to sleep, he woke up in a slightly parallel version of the world. And so he personally had a good memory, but the problem was he was remembering the wrong universes. And that kind of spun out of this character's one kind of very light, one unique thing of, I have a horrible memory.
I'm curious, and I guess I have 2 questions. Like, first of all, when you're making characters and like, let's say I'm the GM and my players are, saying this is my one unique thing, is it just like the player says what it is and we roll with it, or is there negotiation that goes on between the GM and players, or is that something that every group decides for themselves?
I think a lot of it you have to kind of work with the GM to determine the scope of what it is that you want it to be. For instance, in one of my campaigns, I had a character who initially I just wanted him to hear voices in my head. And it ended up being, after fleshing that idea out a little bit more with the GM, that I was actually had another person living inside of my head. He had been a wizard and had cast a spell of immortality, and it backfired on him. And so he now just body hops from person to person, and I happen to be chosen to be the one carrying him. So it's a little bit of, you start out with something you want, and it may just be just exactly what it is that you want, but you really do want to work with the GM and kind of flesh out the specifics and details of what would work best in the campaign.
And in the main rule book, they do call out that GMs should work with the players, but they do kind of have the final say. If they come up with something that's completely wacky compared to everyone else or what you were planning on doing, GMs work with your players, but in the end, GM approval is actually rule 0, I think.
So yeah, I was thinking like the Dark Elf thing. Like, what if I was planning on doing a campaign that centered on the Dark Elves in the court, and then I have a player that says, I'm the only Dark Elf in the court. It's like, well, I guess I could make them something else.
Yeah.
Suddenly they're all pixies. They're evil pixies instead of Dark Elves.
You should really just count on your players' backgrounds and icon relationships and one unique things completely mucking with anything you have planned going into a game.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, different GMs do it different ways, and I've done it different ways. But one thing that I like doing with most games is I might have kind of a basic idea of what I want to do with the campaign, but I like to get the player characters made like really early and then say, hey, now I'm going to figure out exactly what I'm going to do. And it seems like that would work really well with 13th Age, where you kind of, as GM, you come to the table just kind of like, I've got a couple ideas, but I'm going to wait until you guys make your characters to really decide what the campaign's going to be. It seems like that would work better.
Yeah, or give just a very brief, like, elevator pitch, like...
Yeah.
Oh, I kind of want to do some political intrigue in Axis, and leave it kind of at that level. Or,
right.
Parse down the available icons. If you have no desire to run a war campaign, it probably... So 13th Age has 13 icons that are kind of your archetypal movers and shakers that you would see in fantasy worlds. So like an archmage and a priestess and an orc lord and a dwarf king and those kind of things. So even by restricting the icons when you come to the table, you can kind of funnel your players towards a certain style of game.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it was actually in the DMG recently, or somewhere I was reading about, planning too much as a GM, and how the more detailed what you have planned for like the campaign or a session is, the less receptive you are to things the players come up with, because you're like, oh, I have this thing I want to do and I really want to do it, and if I let them do this thing, it might not happen. And so it was kind of recommending being more kind of loose with things so that you can be more receptive to whatever crazy thing the players do.
Yeah.
So like not even like the Dark Elf thing, like not even saying I'm going to do a campaign about Dark Elves and wait, just say I want to do a campaign with intrigue and just like leave it there and see where it goes.
Well, we mentioned that you normally roll the icon relationship dice at the beginning of the session. There are some situations where you may want the players to roll them mid-session too. And, again, depending on how they roll, it may totally veer the course of the events from what you had in mind. So I think you really got to be flexible, or at least have everything, in little boxes that you can just fit into different areas.
Yeah. I suppose you could have them do that at the end of the session for the next time, so you know.
Yes,
yeah.
That's actually one of the pieces of advice they give, especially for either GMs that like to prepare a little more or people new to 13th Age.
Okay.
I'm very improvisational, but even when I first started, had people roll at the end of the session just so I could make sure I was tying those in.
Yeah, well, that sounds great, because I've personally, as a GM, I've been trying to kind of stretch my improv muscles, because I'm one that tends to prepare a lot, and I feel like, the golden land is, coming in and just doing everything on the fly. So I've been trying to do more and more of that to kind of practice. And it seems like this would be a really great system for someone wanting to do that, or someone that already does that, because you kind of can do this at the beginning of the session and have some guidance for where to take the story, but it's like nobody knew until you rolled those dice what was going to happen. It's kind of cool.
Exactly. Like if you plan, like I want thugs to attack the group, and you kind of sketch out that encounter. Don't plan on whose thugs they are. Wait till their relationship dice are rolled. And if, Nick rolls a conflicted die with, the Great Gold Worm, which is kind of the champion of paladins, well, maybe some paladins mistake the group for someone else. You have your thug fight, but they're now paladin flavored, and at the end they get the information that the thugs were meant to deliver the whole time. But that way it ties back to what the character's decision about his character, what the player's decision about his character was.
Awesome. Yeah. So another question I have is, do you normally play this game theater of the mind, or do you use a grid and miniatures, or is it either or?
I'd say it kind of depends on what you want to run at your table.
Okay.
As far as like combat and movement and things like that, it's not grid based. It's very similar to Numenera or Star Wars, where you're either you're engaged, you're close, you're near, you're far away.
Okay.
And it's a move action to move, get closer or move around. So I think it's a lot of that's more theater of the mind. Hey, I want to go over and slash at this guy. Okay, well, you got a move action and you got a standard action, so go for it. And that also gives you the flexibility of saying, hey, I actually want to jump off this ledge, grab the chandelier, do a backflip, and stab downward with my sword. And that would involve a skill check in addition to the attack roll. And that's something where you could use maybe a background in combat. But it really gives a lot of flexibility for flavor of telling a really epic story, something that you can walk away from with good memories and be chatting about it the next week or the next month, saying, hey, do you remember that time when I rolled underneath the dragon and stabbed upward and it fell over dead, sort of thing. Yeah.
Nice.
If you're just using a normal grid and you've got to count the squares, you really can't get that level of epicness in it. I've found that it works best just to visualize the combat scene to go ahead and use miniatures on a map, but it's just to keep a visual representation of where all of the pieces are.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
There's only one mechanic that gets a little too fuzzy for me if you're not at least having, like Nick said, just the scene sketched out on a piece of paper with some token representation. There's a mechanic called intercept, which as long as you're standing between the monster and your ally, if the monster moves in, you can basically countercharge and force them to engage you. And as a person who likes to play fighters, that mechanic is very important to me. So
Right.
It gets GMs have to be a little bit more flexible in the theater of the mind style combat, but
Yeah, you have kind of a similar thing. Even in 5th edition, they have the opportunity attacks, what were attacks of opportunity. And kind of my personal philosophy with that, because I like to do theater of the mind, I don't like using miniatures usually, is I tend to favor the players, so more often than not, when, a player's like, oh, can I take an opportunity attack, I'll usually say yes.
yeah.
Just because I found in the past that if I say no too much, then the players are like, hey, can we use miniatures? Because I feel like I'm getting ripped off here.
Or they start pulling out the rule books and say, but it says right here that I can.
Yeah.
Start getting rule lawyers.
Yeah. But I found if you give them more than they think they should have, they usually won't complain.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, well, that is going to wrap up the 13th episode of Game Master's Journey. Thanks again to JM and Nick for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate it. Again, this was the first half of the interview, so you can catch the rest of the interview next week in episode 15. If you would like to reach me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can find me on Google+, just search for Lex Starwalker, and you can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please visit the website at starwalkerstudios.com, where you can find the show notes to this episode, which will have lots of helpful links for you to find out more about 13th Age, find out more about JM and Nick, find out more about iconic podcasts, all kinds of great stuff. You can also find links there to the Game Masters Journey Google Plus community. I really hope that you will join me there. It's a great place to connect with other players and GMs of role-playing games and swap ideas and just have a good time and connect with like-minded nerds like myself. If you enjoy Game Masters Journey and you would like the show to continue, and if you'd like to support Starwalker Studios, once again, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/GameMastersJourney, or you can use the link in the show notes. We also have a donate button on the website at starwalkerstudios.com if you'd prefer to make a one-time donation. Another great way that you can help out the show is to try a free trial of Audible books courtesy of Game Masters Journey. You can find links and more information about that in the show notes. And finally, you can also help us out by using our Amazon referral link. So for this episode in the show notes, you will find a link to 13th Age on Amazon. You can click that link and then buy whatever you want to buy on Amazon. It's not going to cost you anything more, but we get a little bit of support from Amazon every time someone uses that link. So if you're really a fan of Starwalker Studios, you could use that link every time you shop on Amazon. That would be awesome. So once again, I want to thank you so much for supporting the show and listening to Game Masters Journey. I am Lex Starwalker, and I hope that you will keep gaming.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.